In Roman Egypt, death could look startlingly alive. A body swaddled in linen, resin seeping through the bandages, and where an ancient gilded mask might have sat in earlier centuries, a lifelike wood portrait of a person who gazes back across 2 millennia. These are the Fayum mummy portraits, panels painted in the 1st to 3rd centuries AD and fitted onto mummies from sites in the Fayum Oasis and beyond, Hawara, Rubaiyat, Antinopolis, and the cemeteries around ancient Arsinoe and Heraclides. They are not simply pretty faces, they are laboratory-grade evidence for how Greco-Roman art and Egyptian funerary practice fused into a single technology of remembrance. Start with the support. Thin wood panels cut to the size of a human face and upper chest, sometimes shaped to the shoulders and pierced for lacing into the wrappings. Species identification and tool marks tell a trade story before a portrait ever meets a brush. Many panels are lime wood, tilia, or other imported timbers, occasionally cedar or cypress. Others use local sycamore fig, Ficus sycamoris. The cut, planing chatter, and bevels at the edges show workshop habits. An incised centerline or pricked guide can sit beneath the paint. Isotopic and elemental studies on panel wood, paired with species ID, suggest mixed sourcing. Imported planks arriving through Mediterranean supply chains for urban workshops, local timbers cut when the market or the patron's budget demanded. That wood choice matters because it links portraits in Egypt to a pan-Roman economy, while the iconography and burial context root them firmly in the Nile Valley's beliefs about the afterlife. On top of that wooden field, painters built faces with 2 distinct but often interwoven techniques. Encaustic is the showstopper, molten beeswax, sometimes Punic wax, pre-cooked with alkali to lower the melting point, loaded with pigments and fused to the panel. In the right hands, wax makes light solid, thick impasto for the glint on a lower lip, a warmed stroke for the bulge of the eyeball, a dragged metal spatula, cauterium, to knit mid-tones where cheek turns to jaw. Tempera, typically an aqueous binder like egg or animal glue, sits at the other end of the spectrum. Quick, matte, precise, underdrawing visible, cross-hatching for shadows, fine lines for the iris and lashes. Many portraits are hybrids. Tempera underlayers snapped in with grids and brown-black drawing, then wax highlights fused across the forehead and nose to bring the sitter forward. Pigments themselves tell a material story that is both local and global. Whites are usually lead white. Reds can be red ochre or the mercurial luxury of cinnabar. Yellows are ochre or arsenic sulfides, orpiment realgar. Greens include malachite or mixtures. Blacks are carbon-based, and Egyptian blue, a calcified copper silicate invented long before Rome, lurks in tiny traces that still glow under infrared luminescence, even when the eye thinks a passage is just gray. Gilding, leaf laid over bowl, makes necklaces, wreaths, and earrings flare. Purple clavy on tunics mark status, and a single dot of thick pale wax can be the sparkle that turns a painted pupil into a gaze. If the craft feels Roman and the raw materials circulate across the empire, the use context remains Egyptian. Portraits were created to be seen by the living and then to accompany the dead. Excavation drawings from Flinders Petrie at Hawara show how panels were lashed onto the face, sometimes framed by cartonnage, sometimes built into rigid geometric wrappings decorated with gods and amulets. Names scratched on the back or written in Greek in the paint, Heraclides, Isidora, Artemidorus, anchor the owners in a bilingual world where a Greek education, Roman hairstyles, Egyptian mummification, and local priesthoods coexisted. Hairstyles and jewelry double as timestamps, corkscrew curls and Flavian updos, Hadrianic beards, Severan ornaments, stylistic markers that let art historians date a panel to a few decades, even when tomb context was lost to the early antiquities trade. That mix of identities is not a contradiction. It is the point. In life, the elite of Roman Egypt moved through Hellenistic schools, civic councils, military service, and temple festivals. In death, they folded a Roman portrait practice into an Egyptian theology of the body. The portrait is a passport. Roman realism secures recognition. Egyptian rites secure eternity. That is why the faces are so alive. They are meant to be present, capable of receiving offerings, drinking in the incense curl, seeing their own funeral and eternal meals. Modern lab work is not a sideshow here. It is how we know what we know. Cross-sections under the microscope map, the stack of priming, underpaint, glazes, and wax infill, gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, separates beeswax components and finds resin or oil additives. X-ray fluorescence, XRF, spots lead, copper, iron, mercury. Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, FTIR, distinguishes wax and protein layers, and multispectral imaging pulls out lost drawing, pentimenti, and grid lines. In many cases, a painter snapped a grid to set the head tilt and eye line, then corrected freehand as personality took over. Broad, warm grounds let skin read luminous. Cool gray or green underlayers cool the jaw. Quick, long strokes in encaustic create hair that sits on the skull rather than a flat cap of color. You can follow the hand that learned in a workshop. Jawline laid in with a single confident pull nostril and philtrum punched in with a warmed spatula, then made specific choices for a sitter. The diagonal of a scar on the eyebrow, the hitch of a lip. At Hawara, Er-Rubaiyat, and Antinopolis, cemeteries preserve the other half of the story, how portraits met mummies. Panels were cut to fit the wrap, sometimes trimmed later. Linen bands laced through drilled holes. A resin-soaked shroud fixed the assembly. In some graves, the portrait was already old when it was used, as if a household kept a panel made in youth and then installed it decades later. A reminder that these were domestic, not just funerary objects. Wall nail holes and grime at edges imply some portraits hung in homes before burial, participating in family memory and cult. That domestic phase helps explain why the style so often insists on the sheen of skin, the glint of jewelry, and individualized eyes. These were meant to stand in for a person around people who knew them. Social history emerges not only from faces, but from numbers. Portrait mummies cluster among the prosperous. Military veterans settled in the Fayum, civic elites, merchants, literate households with Greek names and Egyptian lineages. They could afford imported wood, fine linen, spices, and resins for embalming, and the time of a skilled painter. The absence of portraits in many burials is just as telling. Most Egyptians continued older funerary styles without panel likenesses, and even among portrait users, the practice is concentrated in a few generations. That arc, 1st century peak, tapering by the mid-3rd century, tracks bigger currents. Roman taxation, currency shocks, changes in local workshops, and perhaps a shift in taste from molten wax to crisper tempera that ends eventually in different memorial habits as the late antique world changes. Loss, too, is part of the evidence. The 19th and early 20th century market-prized faces, not mummies. Dealers cut panels free, context disappeared, and paintings drifted into European and American collections labeled only Fayum. Technical projects in the last decade have begun to stitch biographies back together. Wood species mapping across museums, wax and pigment datasets shared between labs, isotope measurements that narrow panel sourcing, and collaborative catalogs that reunite sitter names with old field notes and photographs. The result is a portrait of a system as much as of people. Exporters selling planks, workshops, standardizing panel sizes, artists training in a shared vocabulary of light families, commissioning likenesses that could live first on walls and then on bodies, priests and embalmers building a final assembly where Greek letters and Egyptian gods coexist without friction. The hardest question, who are these people to us, is answered best by paying attention to technique. If an encaustic highlight reads as a heartbeat, that is because a painter knew how wax catches light when it stands proud of the surface. If a tempera eyelash feels intimate, it's because a brush barely loaded with pigmented binder, flicked just so, makes a line with a head and a tail like a real lash. Materials mediate emotion. That is why conservation has become a core part of the scholarship, stabilizing wax that flows at summer heat, consolidating flaking tempera, cleaning darkened resins from earlier repairs, and documenting every intervention so that what survives of a face remains the painter's, not the restorer's. The bigger picture is cultural engineering. Roman Egypt turned beeswax, imported wood, Egyptian blue, and a household grief into an object that solved a very Egyptian problem: how to keep a person present. The portraits prove that Roman and Egyptian were not opposites here. They were ingredients. If you want more evidence-first deep dives that follow the lab trail, how a bit of wax, a wood grain, or a Greek letter rebuilds a whole society, tell us which portrait you want us to decode next, and we'll unpack the pigments and the prayer together in a future episode.